Everyone saw the dust rising before they saw the SUVs. 3 black Tahoes tore up the gravel road, engines roaring, tires kicking dirt across the Texas sky like an invading army. My cattle scattered, their peaceful grazing shattered by the sound of city metal storming into open country. At first, I thought it was law enforcement on official business. But then I caught a glimpse of their uniforms, too clean, too perfect, like something straight out of a TV set. And that's when my stomach sank. Because I realized they weren't real cops. 5 men piled out, moving in some laughable attempt at tactical formation. Their badges gleamed in the sun, shiny enough to impress from a distance but cheap up close, like trinkets from a Halloween store. Still, they carried themselves with an arrogance that only comes when someone thinks fear is enough to get the job done. The leader, a tall man with a tactical cap pulled low over his brow, stepped forward and tried to project authority. "David Turner, you're under arrest for HOA violations." HOA violations, on a 300-acre ranch 5 miles outside their jurisdiction. My first instinct was to laugh, loud and hard, but I didn't, because something about this was too organized. The SUVs matched, the paperwork looked official, and someone had invested real money in this little performance. This wasn't a prank, this was a setup. I dropped the sledgehammer I'd been using to repair my fence and looked them dead in the eyes. My voice was calm, steady, the way it always was when I knew I was about to dismantle someone's lies. "Gentlemen, impersonating a peace officer in Texas is a felony, and right now, you're knee-deep in it." The leader's face flushed red. He barked, "Sir, you need to comply with our lawful orders immediately." His voice cracked on the word lawful. That crack told me everything. They were bluffing, and they knew it. So I pulled out my phone, pressed record, and walked straight toward them. "Show me your credentials," I demanded. "Not those costume shop badges, your real IDs." That's when the cracks spread faster. One shuffled his feet, another avoided eye contact, and the tall one, he snapped, "Put that phone away." "Wrong answer." I hit the dial button. The real 911 dispatcher's voice broke through the heavy Texas heat. "McLennan County Sheriff's Office, what's your emergency?" I made sure every word was crisp, recorded, undeniable. "This is David Turner. I have 5 individuals on my property impersonating law enforcement, attempting an unlawful arrest. I need a unit dispatched immediately." And right then the fear set in. Not for me, for them. The fake cops shifted uneasily, eyes darting back to their SUVs, because they realized they hadn't stumbled onto just any rancher. They picked the wrong man. They had no idea I'd spent 25 years as the Texas State Attorney General. I'd seen fraud in every costume imaginable. Mafia fronts, cartel disguises, corrupt bureaucrats, name it, I'd prosecuted it. And now, 5 wannabe enforcers in cheap tactical gear thought they could intimidate me into compliance. Not today, not ever. I walked closer, filming their badges, their uniforms, every forged detail. "These warrants you're waving around," I said, "pure fraud. Livestock disturbance isn't even an arrestable offense in Texas. You've just committed multiple felonies in the last 15 minutes. Congratulations." The leader tried to hold his ground, but his eyes twitched. His men shuffled behind him, suddenly looking less like officers and more like guilty kids caught stealing candy. My cattle, now huddled at the far end of the pasture, stared back at the scene like silent witnesses to a showdown. And as the sound of a real sheriff's siren began to echo faintly in the distance, I felt that old rush I hadn't experienced since retirement. The adrenaline of knowing criminals had walked straight into my world, thinking they were predators, when in reality, they were prey. But one thought gnawed at me even as I held my ground. This wasn't random. Someone had paid for those SUVs. Someone had printed those documents. Someone had chosen me as their target. And I couldn't help but wonder, why? The siren grew louder, cutting through the hot Texas air like a blade. The 5 men stiffened. Their little act was crumbling by the second, and they knew it. One of them muttered something under his breath, a curse maybe, while the leader's jaw clenched so tight I thought his teeth might snap. But I just kept recording. Every twitch, every glance, every bead of sweat rolling down their too clean collars. "You boys want to explain this paperwork?" I asked, holding up their so-called warrant. It looked good, almost convincing. Embossed seals, a judge's signature, even a watermark. I held it to the sun, pretending to study it like a man who might actually be fooled. And then I let the silence hang, long enough for them to think they'd pulled it off, long enough for them to almost believe it themselves. Then I said it, calm, surgical, the way a prosecutor delivers a final nail in the coffin. This court seal doesn't exist in McLennan County. This judge retired 8 years ago, and these violations not enforceable by anyone, let alone an HOA. The leader's eyes twitched. The others shifted like dominoes about to fall. And that's when the sheriff's cruiser rolled up my drive, lights flashing red and blue across the wide pasture. Deputy Williams stepped out, hand on his holster, scanning the scene like a hawk. He was no rookie, a man who could tell real from fake with a single glance. And the moment his eyes landed on their badges, I saw the recognition click. "Private security has zero arrest authority in Texas," Williams said flatly. His voice carried the weight of law, cutting through the charade. "Y'all mind explaining what you're really doing on Mr. Turner's property?" Their leader tried to hold his ground. "We're special HOA enforcement officers." Williams cut him off. "No, you're not. That simple, that final." I handed over my phone, showing Williams the footage. Every second of their fake arrest attempt, every forged document, every fraudulent detail. I pointed out the misspelled statute codes, the cheap adhesive badges, the tactical gear that screamed online purchase rather than official issue. Williams didn't even bother hiding his disdain. "These documents are fabricated," he said, flipping through the pages. "Wrong seals, wrong language, wrong everything." The 5 men began tripping over their own lies. First, they claimed they were working under county orders, then an environmental agency, then, laughably, back to HOA authority. Their story changed so fast it was hard to keep track. But none of it mattered now. The deputy had already run my name through dispatch. Clean record, valid property deed. Ranch 5 miles outside any HOA jurisdiction. Every excuse they'd brought with them had collapsed under the weight of reality. Still, as they stood there sweating under the Texas sun, I couldn't shake the bigger question clawing at me. Who had sent them? Because this operation wasn't cheap. 3 matching SUVs, forged documents that would have fooled half the county, uniforms sharp enough to make a man hesitate. This wasn't amateur night. Someone had bankroll, someone had motive, and someone thought I was worth the risk. The fake officers finally retreated, Williams taking down their license plates before letting them crawl back to their vehicles. I stood there, dust settling around me, heart pounding with a familiar adrenaline I hadn't felt since my courtroom days. And for the first time in years, I realized retirement was over. Because this wasn't just about me. How many elderly ranchers had caved under this same pressure? How many had signed over their land, terrified of arrest by men who looked official enough to convince them? As the last SUV disappeared down my gravel road, I felt it in my bones. This was no one-off. This was systematic, and whoever was pulling the strings had just declared war. They thought I was just another rancher, just another easy target. But they'd forgotten something. I'd spent my life dismantling operations just like theirs. And now I was coming for them. The morning sun spilled across my kitchen table, turning it into a battlefield of paper. I'd laid out every fraudulent document those men had tried to serve me, every forged seal, every bogus signature. To most folks, it would have looked official. To me, it was laughable. I'd spent decades dissecting evidence, and these pages screamed deception. Still, the effort behind them rattled me. These weren't quick knockoffs run off a home printer. The letterhead was crisp. The stamps were layered with detail, the legal phrasing carefully crafted to mimic real government language. Someone had poured serious money into this operation. And one name kept surfacing in the paperwork like a bad penny: Nancy Moore. That afternoon, I drove into McLennan County and walked straight into the courthouse. The records office smelled of dust and bureaucracy, but I knew exactly where to look. When I asked about recent HOA filings, the clerk gave me the usual government shuffle: confidentiality, procedures, red tape. I leaned in, calm but firm. Ma'am, I served as Attorney General of this state for 8 years. I know which records are public, and I know you've got them. Her eyes widened. 30 seconds later, she was pulling file after file onto the counter. And what I found chilled me. Nancy Moore hadn't just filed 1 or 2 questionable documents. She'd been at it for months. A steady drip of fraudulent filings designed to build a legal web around my property. Emergency zoning declarations that didn't exist in county code. Environmental reports claiming my cattle polluted non-existent waterways. Safety violations for buildings no inspector had ever laid eyes on. Each filing on its own was small, almost harmless. But stacked together, they painted a damning picture, a paper trail meant to justify drastic action. A trail that, to the untrained eye, could almost pass as legitimate authority. I counted 12 separate forgeries, 12 felonies minimum, and that was just in my county. I left the courthouse with those records burned into my mind, my briefcase heavier than when I'd walked in. The pattern was obvious. Start with harmless complaints, escalate gradually, and eventually create the illusion of authority strong enough to seize property. I'd seen organized fraud rings before, but this was bold. Back at the ranch, Deputy Williams showed up again, his cruiser crunching over the gravel. He had news that only confirmed my suspicions. Mr. Turner, we've been digging into Guardian Security, the outfit behind those fake cops. They're licensed private security, sure, but their contract with Meadowbrook HOA, way out of bounds, exceeds every legal limit in the book. He paused, his eyes narrowing. We've also found they've pulled this stunt before, not once, not twice. 6 times in the past year, always the same playbook, elderly ranchers, fake warrants, bogus arrests, and every single time the victim signed over property. My gut clenched. 6 times, 6 families stripped of their land by cowards hiding behind fake uniforms. How many more had stayed quiet, too ashamed or too scared to come forward? The walls of my quiet ranch life felt like they were closing in. I had come out here to escape politics, to trade courtrooms for pastures, to live in peace. But peace had been broken, and the old instincts, the prosecutor's instincts, were waking up again. I thought about the victims, the ones too trusting of authority, the ones who saw flashing lights and badges and believed, without question, that the law was standing in front of them. And I thought about Nancy Moore, filing her papers, smiling at her neighbors, sitting at her HOA meetings while secretly orchestrating one of the most despicable fraud schemes I'd ever seen. That night, as the sun sank red over my fields, I sat on the porch with a bourbon in my hand. I replayed the confrontation, the lies, the forged authority, and that one gnawing thought returned stronger than ever. This wasn't just about money. This was personal. Someone wanted me tested. Someone thought retirement had made me soft. Someone believed David Turner had forgotten what it meant to fight. But if that's what they believed, they just made the most expensive mistake of their lives. Because I wasn't just going to defend my ranch. I was going to burn their entire scheme to the ground. The room went silent the second I walked in, not the polite hush of a community center meeting, but the kind of silence that tests you, stretches you, waits to see what you'll do next. Faces turned. Conversations died mid-sentence. I set my briefcase on the table like it was evidence being laid out in a courtroom and let the sound of folding chairs settle into a tense rhythm. Nancy Moore looked up first. Her smile was the practiced kind people wear when they think they're in control. It didn't reach her eyes. For a moment she looked almost small, like the person she'd been before she learned how to hide behind other people's trust. The chairwoman's little counsel stiffened as I set my recorder on the table and opened my case. "Ladies and gentlemen," I said, my voice was low, measured. Old habits, clear, precise, undeniable, sharpened every syllable. "What I'm about to show you isn't opinion, it's evidence." The first paper I pulled out caught the light, a forged seal printed with a skillful hand designed to intimidate. I let them look at it. Let them imagine its authority, then I dismantled it. Point by point, seal, judge, language, the room shifted. Some leaned forward, hungry for clarity. Others leaned back, defensive, like people hearing bad news about someone they trusted. Nancy tried to cut in, voice high and defensive. Those are legitimate filings. I was acting in the community's best interest. You could see the doubt creep into her words the way rust eats paint. I walked the room through the forgeries like a man conducting a demonstration, methodically revealing each fake stamp, each wrong court reference. I read phrases aloud that sounded official until you understood their emptiness. I named the statutes they pretended to invoke and explained, in plain language, how each one fit nowhere in Texas law. A woman near the back covered her mouth, eyes wide. An older man folded his hands and stared at his knuckles as if they, too, were part of the evidence. The murmurs began, at first polite, then threaded with anger. "Why would she do this?" someone whispered. "Who benefits from scaring people off their land?" That's when he walked in. Richard Blackstone, smooth as a lawyer on TV, suited like a man who's never had to scrub a fence post or fix a gate. He moved to the front with a measured confidence, like a shark circling still water. He introduced himself as a consultant, a businessman interested in community development. His smile was the kind built in a boardroom, the kind that politeness lets stand even when your gut screams otherwise. "Mr. Blackstone," I said, not unkindly, "you should know I've already checked your credentials." I pulled up the bar registry on my phone and let the screen glow between us. The color drained from his face. He kept his smile, but it was a mask starting to crack. He tried the old lines, legal-sounding, flattering, meant to distract. "We're revitalizing areas, helping with infrastructure." His words slid around the room, landing like oil on hot pavement. I watched people's faces change. Some nodded, remembering the promises of better roads and new development. Others, especially those who'd lived through land loss in their families, clenched their jaws. Then I laid out the rest of the evidence. Court filings from 3 counties. Surveillance photos showing uniforms in reconnaissance. Emails linking his company to Guardian Security. Financial records hinting at payments moving through shell entities. Each piece snapped together like a lock clicking shut. A hush fell again, this one not of expectation but of realization. Nancy tried to speak, voice small now. "I was told." "You were paid," I answered quietly, "and you chose to believe it was legitimate instead of checking." The truth landed heavier than any accusation could. Some in the room recoiled. Others stared at Nancy with something that used to be called betrayal but now looked more like fear for their own safety. Blackstone's associates shifted position, that subtle move men make when they weigh the risk of getting physical in a room full of witnesses. I kept my recorder obvious, my posture relaxed but unyielding. There's a difference between courage and bravado. The men flanking Blackstone were testing where the line was. I stood in that line, not to threaten, to see who stepped across it. "You've been filing fabricated documents, directing private security to impersonate officers, and coordinating with companies under different names to disguise payments," I said. "That's conspiracy, that's fraud, and I have witnesses." The room erupted like a dam breaking. Some shouted, some cried. People demanded answers. Blackstone tried to regain control with carefully worded denials, but every sentence he spoke made him sound smaller, as if he'd been inhaling his own lies for too long. It was the sound of a man losing his stage. Before things spiraled beyond words, the deputy's voice cut through the chaos. He'd come in quietly and watched, file in hand, law at the ready. "We're taking statements tonight," he said. "We'll open a formal investigation." The words felt like a lifeline thrown into a swirling current. Relief mingled with rage in the room. People looked at each other like survivors who'd finally seen the faces of the men who'd hunted them. As the crowd began to file out, conversations erupting into the parking lot like thunder, I stayed at the table and watched Nancy fold in on herself. She offered murmured apologies that sounded small in the face of what had been done. Blackstone tried to catch my eye, and for a split second there was a flicker of something like recognition. That moment when the predator sees the teeth of the prey. He left with a promise to cooperate. He left with a smile that said nothing, but he left. And when the doors closed behind him, the room felt different, rawer, more honest. I gathered up my notes, the recorder's light still blinking. I'd expected resistance. I hadn't expected the relief on people's faces when the truth finally landed. But relief is only a beginning. The real work, tracing payments, unmasking shell companies, making federal prosecutors sit up and listen, was just starting. As I walked back to my truck, my phone buzzed with one new message, Agent Walsh. Her text was short, precise, the kind that only comes when something bigger is moving. "We need to talk, meet me in Austin." And in that moment, standing under a Texas sky that suddenly seemed too small for the storm coming, I felt the first undeniable taste of what this fight would cost. The knock on my door came before dawn, a light, urgent rap that pulled the night apart. My first thought was not danger, it was habit, the courtroom discipline that trains you to be awake the instant trouble calls. I opened the door to Agent Walsh's face, all business and no small talk, like a storm that had decided it was time to land. Her eyes were tired but sharp, the kind of tired that comes from too many late nights and too many people depending on you. "You ready?" she asked without a greeting. No need, we both knew why she was there. We drove to Austin with the sun dragging itself up behind us, the highway stretching wide and empty. In the car, she laid out what they'd found from the early probes, emails, financial transfers, shell companies with names like they were designed to melt into corporate anonymity. The Bureau had already executed preliminary warrants at Summit Properties offices. The results were worse than we'd expected. Organizational charts, payment ledgers, a spreadsheet that looked like a hit list of rural parcels. "You caught them in the act, Turner," Walsh said, tapping the file on her knee. "But we need more than an act. We need structure. We need motive. We need a trail that ties Blackstone to every little piece of this." I thought of Alina, how she'd shown up on my porch with boxes of surveillance and patient evidence collected like a mosaic. I thought of Marcus, sweating through his remorse and handing us keys to the machine from the inside. This was bigger than any one farmhouse or courthouse. This was a network of people who'd built a business model out of terror. Agent Walsh didn't mince words. "If we're going to indict on RICO, we need pattern. We need predicate acts tied together. We need you and the victims to be ready for a war in court." War, it was a heavy word for a Texas morning, but accurate. The Bureau moved in ways that smelled like steel and paperwork and slow, sure justice. We spent the day working through interviews, building outlines for grand jury testimony, and cataloging evidence into the kind of file that would make a prosecutor smile in private. My porch, my dining room, my life had become an evidence room, and every photograph, every email, every forged seal was now a bullet in a legal armory. But the human cost kept nudging at me, a soft, dangerous pressure behind the chest. Alina's voice when she told me about the day they took her family's ranch. The way some victims avoided eye contact, cheeks flushed with shame for something they didn't commit. The sleepless nights of widowers who'd been convinced by flashing lights and forged warrants that the law had come for them. This wasn't just property. It was legacy, memory, the graves and fences and sweat of generations. That evening, Marcus called and asked to meet. He arrived at dusk, shoulders tight like a man carrying too many truths. He sat across from me, hands busy, fidgeting, apologizing without words. "I want to help," he said simply. He'd handed over payroll records, reconnaissance schedules, and an admission that Blackstone had coached them on making arrests look convincing. His voice broke when he described how they were trained to speak, to move, to make fear feel like law. Regret had softened him, but the damage was done. He couldn't undo it, only help fix what he had helped break. As the pieces fell into place in our briefings, Agent Walsh warned about the kind of pushback we could expect. "They're not just businessmen who made a mistake," she said. "They've got friends in high places and money in accounts that can buy lawyers who will do anything to bury witnesses. Be prepared for threats, for smears, for attempts to buy silence." Her words landed like a forecast, dangerous weather ahead. And then the threats started. First, anonymous calls, static, and a voice that sounded too smooth to be a local bully. Then strange cars parked near Alina's rental, a window broken at a neighbor's barn, the subtle kind of intimidation that doesn't show up on paper until it becomes a pattern. Alina cried once in my kitchen, hands trembling around a mug of coffee. "I wanted them to stop," she said. "I thought if I could prove it, someone would listen." Now she sat under federal protection and yet still felt exposed. Protection doesn't erase the memory of your home being taken. Late one night, as we prepared witness lists, my phone buzzed with a text that made my skin cold. A photo of my mailbox, empty, no message, no signature, just a picture and the implication that someone had been watching. Agent Walsh hardened then. "We'll tighten security," she said. "We'll move fast, but they will push back." I thought of the men who'd come to my driveway with fake badges. I thought of the old folks who'd signed away land like it was a bad dream. I thought of Blackstone, smiling in his suit, believing his money could shield him. Money had bought them arrogance. Money had bought them a temporary advantage. But money couldn't buy away evidence. It couldn't buy away the faces of the victims or the tapes and ledgers sitting in our evidence rooms. The Bureau set timelines and we set meetings with prosecutors. Grand jury subpoenas were drafted. Witnesses were prepped and rehearsed, each of them practicing the hard act of telling the truth under oath. Every step forward felt like walking a narrow bridge over a canyon. One misstep and the defense would pounce on inconsistencies. We needed ironclad testimony, cohesion, a story that could stand up to any attempt at dismantling it. As the week closed, Agent Walsh summoned me for one last late-night briefing before court filings were finalized. She looked me in the eye and said, "They think they can scare people into silence. They don't understand one thing about the people they targeted. Rural communities keep their own counsel. They watch, they speak, and in the end, they take their justice." Outside, the ranch was quiet, but the sky held the hush before a storm. I stood on my porch, watching the dark gather, thinking about the cost of truth. I knew the trial would be long, ugly, and dangerous. I also knew it was necessary. Some fights I'd learned you don't get to choose. They choose you. And when they do, you either stand or you let the darkness win. Tonight, I chose to stand. The first shots were about to be fired. The courthouse steps felt heavier that morning, like every stride carried the weight of generations. Farmers, widows, ranchers in their Sunday best, people who had been tricked, broken, shamed into silence, were now walking side by side with me into a building that had once seemed distant, unreachable. Their faces told the story better than any evidence could. Some were lined with years of labor, others streaked with tears they hadn't meant to shed in public. But all of them carried the same look, tired of running, ready to fight. Inside, the grand jury chamber was colder than I remembered. Marble floors, the quiet hum of fluorescent lights, the shuffle of papers echoing louder than footsteps. I'd been here 100 times in my career, but never as the man telling the story. Always the one guiding others. Today, I was the witness. Today, I was the victim. The prosecutor's voice was calm, steady, built to carry trust. "Mr. Turner, please describe what happened on the morning the defendants attempted to arrest you." I spoke clearly, my words deliberate, letting silence stretch in the right places. I described the SUVs, the fake badges, the forged warrants. I let the jury picture the arrogance in those men's eyes and the fear they tried to manufacture on my land. When I held up the fraudulent paperwork for them to see, a hush fell, thick, heavy, disbelieving. One juror shook her head slowly, as though trying to imagine her own father or grandfather standing where I had stood. Then came Alina. Her hands shook as she raised them to take the oath, but her voice did not falter. She told them how her family had been cornered with the same tricks. She painted the picture of flashing lights in the dark, of men yelling threats her children still whispered about in nightmares. By the time she finished, there were tears in the jury box, not because she asked for pity, she never once did, but because truth spoken plainly has a weight that crushes excuses. Marcus followed. He confessed. Every detail, every order Blackstone had given, every way they had rehearsed intimidation. His voice was heavy with regret, but it was steady. He wasn't saving himself. He was burning bridges behind him, making sure there was no way back to the men who had pulled the strings. Piece by piece, the story became undeniable. Surveillance photos, bank transfers routed through 3 states, recordings of Nancy Moore's meetings where she coached her neighbors on language they didn't realize was fraudulent. And then the coup de grace, emails tying Blackstone directly to Guardian Security, laying out timelines for acquisitions, as if people's homes were nothing more than entries on a balance sheet. The defense tried their best. Smooth suits, practiced objections, questions designed to trip us into contradictions. But every time they reached for a thread, the fabric held. Walsh's team had stitched it too tightly, too cleanly. We weren't just telling stories, we were laying out a machine, showing how it worked, who built it, and who profited from it. Still, the tension was brutal. Every break in the testimony felt like standing in front of a firing squad waiting to see if the guns would go off. Blackstone sat at the table, unbothered on the surface, but I watched him closely. His smile never touched his eyes anymore. His hands tapped, restless on the table. That was the tell, the predator who realizes the hunt has turned. Outside the chamber, we gathered in the hallway. Some victims hugged. Others sat in silence, processing what it meant to finally be heard. Elena leaned against the wall, whispering, "Do you think they'll finally believe us?" I put a hand on her shoulder. "They don't have a choice anymore." That night, I returned home to a ranch cloaked in quiet. The stars stretched wide above me, but peace didn't come. My phone buzzed with another message. No words, just a photo of Elena's car parked outside her safe house. My blood ran cold. They were still out there, still watching, still desperate. I stood on my porch, the old boards creaking beneath me, and I realized this wasn't the endgame. This was the middle of the storm. The courtroom could deliver justice, but justice doesn't always stop men like Blackstone. Sometimes it only makes them more dangerous. And that was the question I couldn't shake as I stared into the Texas night. Would truth be enough to keep us safe, or had we just painted targets on our backs? The courtroom felt smaller that day, as if the walls had been pulled in to listen closer. My hands were steady, but my heart beat like a drum under a suit I hadn't worn in years. People who'd come to sit in the gallery, farmers with calloused hands, widows in sensible coats, neighbors who'd watched their own land slip away, leaned forward the way people do when a story gets to the part where everything could change. "Ladies and gentlemen," the prosecutor said, voice low, "we're going to show you what happens when money buys a badge." The defense tried their theatrics first. Smooth questions meant to trip Elena, carefully timed pauses to suggest inconsistency, an implication that trauma makes memory faulty. They painted pictures in the jury's mind, a grieving witness, a man with a grudge, a community leader put to shame. It was a familiar playbook. But Elena did something they hadn't expected. She looked at them like a woman who had been lied to for years and decided she'd rather die than lie again. Her answers were quiet, precise. The photographs she'd taken, the black SUVs at dusk, the men practicing their performance, the ledger showing payments routed through shell companies, fit together like teeth in a key. Every time the defense tried to pry one piece loose, another piece fell into place. Then Blackstone's team pulled their big move. Out walked a man in a suit so expensive it seemed to have been tailored to the jury box. He introduced himself as a community developer, a man of vision, a philanthropist whose investments were meant to help small towns grow. He spoke of jobs and roads and better schools, the language of good intentions wrapped in a well-earned smile. The gallery caught its breath. Some faces softened. Who doesn't want to believe in progress? And I felt the old sting of how persuasive charm can be. But charm is not proof, and proof was what we had. During cross-examination, their witness stumbled. They tried to patch him with rehearsed answers, but Marcus taped statements and the bank transfers on our exhibit table cut through the gloss. The defense's witness had been shown selected documents. He hadn't seen the full trail. The prosecutor left nothing dangling. Each answer led back to Guardian Security, to Summit Properties, to the shell companies that hid the money. Still, the pressure rose. The defense shifted to a new tactic, smears pressed into careful questions. "Isn't it true," they asked Elena, "that you once spoke of bitterness toward developers? Didn't you once tell a neighbor you wanted retribution?" The insinuation was poisonous. For a second, the room smelled like it would fall into the old trap, blame the victim. But Elena's voice was steadier than the accusation. She told the truth. She told them about the night she signed papers she thought were legal because a man in a suit told her they were. About the nights her children woke with nightmares, about the shame that kept her silent. The courtroom listened, and the poison lost its edge. Outside, the world was not patient. The threats we'd endured materialized in a new, ugly way. Mid-trial, a local paper ran a hit piece painting me as a bitter ex-prosecutor using his name to grab headlines. The piece made claims about vendettas and overreach, a thin veneer over a smear attempt funded by shadowy ads. The timing was obvious. The intent was clear. Muddy the water, make witnesses doubt, make jurors wonder if they were watching a personal crusade instead of a legal case. Agent Walsh didn't flinch. She moved like a ship cutting through fog, quiet, relentless, precise. Through an extraordinary late-night review of seized communications, she pulled a thread that the defense hadn't anticipated. Hidden in a chain of emails was an instruction from Blackstone, short, businesslike, about ensuring convincing performances for operations next quarter, and a subsequent payment labeled as consulting. The message had been routed through an offshore account, then through a domestic shell. The forensic analyst testified in a slow, deliberate voice. The transfers matched the Guardian security payroll dates. The memo matched Marcus' statements about instructions to make arrests look authentic. The room went still. You could have heard the soft rustle of a juror's hand against their program. The defense lawyer's face slowly paled, the practiced mask slipping when confronted by money trails and voice-recorded orders. Blackstone's jaw clenched like a man hearing the collapse of a long-constructed lie. But the danger had not been neutralized. The night after that evidence hit the record, there was an attempt to break into Alina's storage unit. Nothing was taken, only the padlock cut and a note left inside that said simply, "We see you." The note was enough to make people flinch, enough to remind us that there were still corners where money buys men willing to threaten. That fear sharpened resolve. The witnesses did fold. If anything, the intimidation steeled them. Marcus took the stand again, not in dramatic confession, but in the slow, plain deliberation of a man willing to point to the parts of a machine he'd been asked to oil. He described meetings where Blackstone's tone shifted from persuasive to commanding, where legalese was used as a tool to make ordinary people feel small and helpless. Each description tied another knot in the conspiracy. When closing arguments came, the prosecutor spoke of trust, how communities are built on it and how predators prey on it. He framed the evidence not as a series of technical crimes, but as a deliberate campaign to extract land through fear. The defense tried to paint the defendants as legitimate businessmen who'd made a mistake, as people overreached but not malicious. Their words felt thin after months of recordings, transfers, and testimony. The jury filed out to deliberate. For a long moment, the courtroom felt like a held breath. I found myself thinking of small things. My wife's laugh when she thought I was done with conflict, the creak of the porch swing at dusk, the way Alina trembled but did not look away. Justice, I had learned, is messy and slow and vulnerable to being bought or scared. But it is also the place where truth, when gathered and pressed, can become something stubborn and immovable. As the doors closed and the jury took their time, I realized the fight wasn't over even if the gavel soon fell. Exposure makes criminals dangerous. Conviction makes them desperate. We had pressed our case into the light, and the next move could come from any dark corner. The phone buzzed with a single message from Agent Walsh. "Be ready. The verdict is coming, and so is the world watching it." The jury filed back in with faces carved from stone. No hints, no flickers, just the solemn look of people who had carried a weight heavier than they expected. My chest felt tight, the way it had so many years ago, waiting on verdicts I'd argued myself. But this time, it was my life, my land, my name sitting in the balance. The foreman rose. Papers in his hand trembled only slightly. His voice carried across the silence. "On the charges of fraud, conspiracy, and impersonating law enforcement." He paused, too long, too sharp, and for one cruel heartbeat the whole world seemed to hold its breath. "Guilty." The word dropped like a hammer, then another, and another. Each count rolled out with the same finality. Fraud, guilty. Conspiracy, guilty. Identity crimes, guilty. My knees didn't buckle, but my grip on the bench tightened like I'd been holding on through a storm that finally broke. Alina began to cry, not the quiet tears of fear, but the sharp sobs of relief that rise when you realize the nightmare isn't chasing you anymore. Marcus bowed his head, shoulders shaking with something halfway between sorrow and release. The gallery erupted in gasps, then cheers, then the shaky applause of people who hadn't believed justice would really come. Blackstone sat frozen, lips pressed thin, the mask finally gone. His lawyers scrambled, already drafting appeals, but the reality had landed. His empire wasn't just cracked, it was shattered. Nancy Moore crumpled in her chair, the weight of betrayal settling on her in front of neighbors who now looked at her with something colder than anger, disappointment. The judge's gavel restored order, but the tide had already turned. Sentencing was set, custody ordered. And when marshals moved to escort Blackstone out, I caught a flicker in his eyes, not fear, not even rage, but a hollow emptiness. The look of a man who built his kingdom on lies and now had nothing left to stand on. Outside, the steps of the courthouse were alive with voices. Reporters thrust microphones forward. Victims embraced, some whispering prayers of thanks, others laughing through their tears. A rancher I'd never met gripped my hand so hard it hurt. "You did it," he said. "You saved us." But I shook my head. We did it together. That night back on my ranch, the air felt different. Clean, lighter, as if the land itself had been waiting for this moment. I walked the fence line in the dark, listening to the steady lowing of cattle, the rustle of grass, the quiet freedom of a place no one could take with lies. For the first time in months, the shadows didn't feel like eyes watching. Still, I knew better than to believe it was over. Power never surrenders quietly. There would be appeals, maybe more threats, perhaps even whispers of retaliation. But the spell had been broken. The illusion of authority was gone, and the people who had been silenced now knew their voices carried weight. I poured a glass of bourbon, sat on the porch, and let the night wrap around me. The trial had been a war fought with paper, testimony, and courage. The scars would linger, in Alina's haunted dreams, in Marcus's broken conscience, in every farmer who'd hesitated to trust again. But scars, I reminded myself, are proof you survived. Looking out at the land I almost lost, I thought about the lesson buried in all of it. Justice isn't about titles or offices or the years you served. It's about standing up when the world tells you to sit down. It's about remembering that fear only wins if you let it. And it's about knowing that sometimes the most ordinary people carry the strength to bring down the most extraordinary lies. As the stars stretched wide above the Texas sky, I let a final thought settle deep in my chest. They had sent fake cops to my ranch, thinking they could break me. Instead, they exposed themselves to the very thing they feared most, truth. And in the end, it wasn't just my land they lost. It was their empire. You've heard this confession, now wait until you hear the next one. The truth that shatters everything you thought you knew.